Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all of the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul Security Weekly. We added Josh Marpet back. He's came out of timeout. His timeout is done.
You're on probation, dude.
He's in non-timeout.
What can I say?
Look at how many waters he has in front of him. Like, what kind of timeout was that?
That's
Waterboarding.
Well, yeah, he also has 2 alcoholic beverages in front of him as well as water.
Which he's going to take a sip and then pour the rest into my glass.
Akira Brand has joined us. Akira, welcome.
Hello.
Hey, Akira.
Hey, thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers. It is good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time, so it's nice to have you here on Paul Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And where is Akira a regular co-host?
Application Security Weekly.
Yeah.
Let her say it.
Oh, Mike Shima. Love that show.
Yeah.
Awesome.
God, we kicked that thing off for
Years ago.
years ago.
I remember the initial conversation the first time I met Mike. Was it RSA?
No, it was because I
Yes.
used to host that show, and I'm like, we need a
another host,
we need a good host, and I'm like, oh, we should do Mike Shima. Mike built the web app scanner at Qualys when I was with him, and I'm like,
It was like the shows were like mini startups in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And like we would start them up, and then we'd be like, all right, who are we going to pass the baton to? And we got amazing people to pass the baton to in every single show.
Right.
And I was like, this is great. I don't have to do 7 shows a week.
yeah, because you and I
we were doing.
oh my
God,
dude, you and I were doing 4 shows a week.
Oh my God.
At a minimum, right? We were.
I
doing,
don't even know how we ran the business doing as many shows as we
We
did.
did
dude.
AppSec, Business Security Weekly. We did Enterprise, Paul's.
I think I was still doing news. Was I doing news? Yeah, like you.
Excuse me, Matt.
We did all the shows.
You did compliance too.
I did compliance too
Yeah.
in the early days, right? And
Before you
were,
canceled me, bitch.
No, we didn't cancel. We didn't
come
cancel.
on, that was CRA.
That was CRA,
Don't
it
give
wasn't
me,
us.
Don't. So I
we
was
say
like,
that
wait,
on
we
the
got to
air?
pass a baton for application. We went to Mike Shima and Mike and John
and Mike has built an awesome team.
Oh, he's
of
built
Kira,
a
yep.
beautiful, beautiful podcast. And Adrian picked up Enterprise Security Weekly from you and me to drive that. And like, oh yeah, it's been
So
awesome.
how is this news?
Oh, I want to talk about news. I got a lot of news I want to talk about. I want to talk about,
What do you want to talk about?
I want to talk about Sonos. There was a NCC group. This is very near and dear to my heart. And I picked up on very esoteric hardware hacking things in this story.
So for the first up, I remember looking at Sonos when we moved into our house right before my wife and I got married, and that was almost 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to put Sonos in all the rooms in our house, and like that was cool. And then like we saw this fall off in Sonos.
Then you thought about all the vulnerabilities that were potentially available.
So what's
Well,
the,
it was
what's
pretty
the,
heinous.
What's the state of Sonos now?
I looked at Sonos security way back in the day, and I was like, well, that's a real problem.
It's a shit show.
Yeah, it was a shit show. And then years later, Sonos did this thing that pissed off their entire user base. Matt and I have had this conversation about cybersecurity companies in general. They like piss off their entire user base, right?
Yep.
And we have advised a lot of companies, and one of the things we always advise them on, like, it's a bad idea to piss off your entire user base. And Sonos is one of those companies that were like, whatever, YOLO, we're just going to end of life all these devices. There's going to be no updates for them unless you have all of our new devices.
Yep.
And it pissed off the entire user base.
I remember this.
Sonos still exists as a company. Fast forward to today, NCC Group looks at the firmware and hardware of Sonos, of one of their newer...
The Era 100?
Era 100. Now, they've done, if you read the article, I mean, it's an amazing chronicle of hardware hacking. But one of the like weird esoteric things that I picked up on, because Larry and I both, our day jobs revolve around doing and working with people that are doing hardware and firmware hacking, right? Is I looked at some of their pictures, and they were like, "Oh, we easily identified the serial port or UART header on the board." I'm like, props to you, because like I wouldn't have easily. I don't know about you, Larry, but like I don't know how they work the word easy into that.
I remember you saying that like that shit's not lined up right. I'm like,
Well,
that
also,
shit's not
like-
lined up right.
Most of the time when I open up like an IoT device, like my Android TV hacking, I open it up, and there's pinouts labeled receive, transmit, ground, and power, and I'm like, oh, that's the UART header.
Yep.
Like, so that's easy to identify because they labeled the ports and they're on the board, and they're all in a nice, neat little line where I can take a pin out, like I can break off 4 pins.
God.
Well, usually power. But the advice from my coworkers and Larry is like, no, don't do power. What did
Transmit,
Mickey,
receive, and ground.
Yeah, what did Mickey say? Mickey said the electrons like to fight each other and
Yeah, they
bad
do.
things can happen, right?
Yeah.
That's how he
You're not
put
wrong.
it.
Ground's always,
Mickey's not wrong.
Ground always
Mickey's
fucks
not
you up.
wrong. And so when I looked at the Sonos pictures, they're like, we easily identified the UART header. And I'm like, none of those pinouts were labeled receive, transmit, ground, or power. Also, they were not in alignment on the board.
Yeah.
Like,
So TX and RX are in alignment in a line, but they're at a specific spacing, and ground and VCC are lined up in a line, but not as the same line as TX and RX, and they're also wider apart. So they're
Like it-
using 2 different pin spacings and 2 different.
Like
Two
my
different
like
planes.
obsessive compulsive thing, I was like, it's just not in alignment. First of all, like that's driving me nuts. And then I'm like, well, why did they do that? I'm like, did they do that so that I can't easily put a pinout header in it? So that do I have to break off individual pins and put them in there and solder them on, or do I have to solder my connections directly onto the board?
Back to our electrical engineering field engineering discussion from like segment 1. Like, get your own breadboard, pin your stuff out.
Pin it out.
Like, there
You'd
you
have
go.
to pin it out.
No,
Yeah.
no, and they say easy, and I would argue, yeah, easy, because if I was going to go attack one of these devices for something like Pwn to Own, this was a device.
Yeah, this is a opponent own thing. Yeah, that's a good point.
I'd be connecting to all of the available pads and using something like my JTagulator looking for UART.
Right. Or
That's easy.
a logic analyzer.
I'd go
Cilia
for
Logic?
Cilia Logic, or
Could do it.
or something of the like.
I think they had to do that with some of the other stuff that they did revolving around the bootloader flaws that
Yep.
they found.
Yep.
They would have to use a logic analyzer, or at least they were soldering directly on the board. I was like, you could probably use a PC byte
Yep,
and just drop the
absolutely.
pins on. So PC byte is like basically like almost like needles, right? That you can drop on a board to
Yep,
sniff
and they
buses
save-
and,
Right.
get
Yep.
to stuff.
Yep.
So
I'd be using something
Easy
like
peasy.
the JTagulator to not just because it will do not just JTag, it will do UART,
SPI,
SPI,
serial-
and,
yeah,
and,
yeah,
and
right,
a bunch of other stuff. So that's all right.
but also
Has any of you guys? Oh, I was gonna say, have any of you guys heard of Ghosty?
no,
Yeah.
what
It's
is it?
a Sonos hack that so it just turns your Sonos speakers into like creepy sounds, and you can freak your friends out with it. It's pretty sweet. Personally, I haven't tried it, but I kind of want to get a Sonos system now and just
And
freak
just
out my
see, right.
So it begins.
yeah. It's
Oh,
like
just start playing with it.
And
oh,
so it
of
begins.
course.
And so it begins.
We talked about
Yeah, why not?
shenanigan. We called it shenanigans. We called it stunt hacking. Yeah.
Shenaniganery.
Shenanigan.
Shenaniganery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a
Shenaniganery.
big fan of shenanigan hacking. Yeah. But the other thing was the flaws that were discovered, Sonos fixed, but never assigned to CVE. Spectral previous conversations for today.
Oh, vulnerability disclosure.
Like, oh yeah,
shit.
like we fixed the stuff, but how are we supposed to track it and know that we're vulnerable if you didn't go through the trouble of assigning a CVE number, which is, as we know, not that hard. Like anyone can get.
Anybody can put a
Anyone
CVE
can write a
into
script
the
to create
NVD.
100 CVEs for pull requests of open source projects.
Oh my god.
Right? And that, I mean, that's pretty much shenanigan hacking right there.
This was
So-
our earlier discussion, Paul, right?
Right.
Like we've got to take the emphasis off of CVEs and really get down to how do we get emphasis, budget, resources, and priorities within inside of organizations for vulnerability management that are not CVEs. Like vulnerability management means vulnerabilities, and those are disclosed and or discovered and or researched. So just because it doesn't have a CVE does not necessarily mean that it shouldn't be dealt with. And honestly, a lot of the can't fix because functioning as intended, vulnerabilities are ones that are critical and are never going to be fixed. Therefore, you're always going to be vulnerable and there's no CVE. So let's get on those and take the emphasis off of the CVEs and make vulnerability management the what it should be.
So what
that's
I hear,
easy to
no. So
hold
what
on.
I just heard Tyler say is that the NVD is lacking when it comes to CVE to CPE vulnerability disclosure to actually report and disclose vulnerabilities on different hardware systems, which is part of the previous segment
It's interesting
around
though.
vulnerability.
I don't think that's it,
Does the CPE come from the CNA, or does it come from I thought NVD was more.
How many
I'm assigning
acronyms can we use
So-
in
Oh,
one
yeah,
sentence
no,
that starts with C?
Dude, I grew up in
CPA,
nuclear
CNE,
power. I can do
CVE.
TLAs all day long.
So I'm gonna short circuit this conversation.
Was that a pun?
I went yes. I went down to the bottom of this article and looked at the disclosure timeline.
You
and
read the article?
I did.
What?
Yeah.
So on
he
9/4, NCC reported the issue to Sonos, not to NVD, not to anyone. Sonos 3 days later says, "Yep, we've got it." 11/29, NCC queries Sonos when are you going to have patches out? And they responded the same day and said, "We released those patches on the 15th." The next day, Sonos says, or NCC says, "Why no release notes, no CVEs, and no credit for our discovery?" On the 1st, NCC tells Sonos, "Hey, screw you guys. We're going to disclose all this stuff, and it'll be on the 4th, and December 4th, they published the blog and advisory." So it was like, we can't blame NVD or any of the CVE stuff on lack of disclosure, lack of creation, because Sonos never reported it. Because it was reported directly to Sonos.
But this.
You can't
this
report
happened-
what you don't know
But
about.
this is back to the previous conversation we just had when we pulled Casey on, right? This whole disclosure episode, right?
Who are we pulling on in this? Are we
if-
pulling anyone else on in this segment?
Maybe. We might. We might just pull somebody
Everyone's
live
got their
on.
phones out now. They're texting.
Yeah, everybody's
Who do you want?
texting like all their friends. But this goes back to the whole process of vulnerability disclosure, right? I go to the manufacturer. Manufacturer does nothing with it. In this case, they actually
They
did something
fixed
with it,
right?
but it was never reported back to any entity to actually kind of log a CVE.
Not even to their customers.
Right. And nobody logged this into the NVD as a vulnerability on this particular product. And so, it doesn't show up in,
It doesn't. It wouldn't get a CVSS score if it didn't get logged to. And so
Correct.
CVE could issue a CVE number, or a CNA could issue a CVE number. NVD typically does the first pass of a CVSS score.
Yep.
Now the manufacturer anyone can do a CVSS score. The manufacturer can also do, or the vendor can do a CVSS score. But none of that happened. So that means, let's take the consumer aspect out of this. Let's say this is some product that's consumed by enterprises. You would never know that I need to go to the next version or what version I need to be at to mitigate a vulnerability, because I never, unless I went to NCC Group and read the blog post,
Right.
I wouldn't know that there's a vulnerability in the gear that I have implemented.
I just maybe see that there's a patch available for my Sonos, and I can't do that right now because it's in use, and I don't want to do that. But I have no idea that there's a security
There's a
vulnerability
security,
because
right.
they didn't even disclose
Right.
it in their release notes.
So we're skirting around an issue that we didn't talk about. I mean, last episode segment was vulnerability management and disclosure, but we just talked about disclosure.
I agree, Jeff.
Frankly. What we're skirting around is the fact that most organizations, their vulnerability management program revolves around a vulnerability scan, and they react and respond and mitigate and patch. Other than Patch Tuesday and all that kind of stuff, they're reactive to what the scan tells them. What I'm
And the CVS or the CVE score.
CVSS
yeah,
score.
but they don't know that until they read it in a scan report, Tyler. I don't know that there's many organizations that are researching and
So
looking
how
for
many
stuff
people
out there.
built a plugin or a CVE to actually identify this
Well,
vulnerability
it begs
to
the
actually
question,
CVSS score?
if there's not a CVE, does that mean there's not a plugin that's built into the major scan engines, and therefore it's not a scan finding, and therefore companies don't know
I
to
feel like
do
this is
anything
like
about it.
a tree fell in the forest, and do we need
Nobody
to patch,
heard-
and nobody heard it, so we don't need to
yeah.
patch.
But it's a
anything?
serious question. For those companies, right or wrong, that are their vulnerability management program revolves around scan findings. What do the scan engine vendors update based on? They based, I mean, we worked.
Yes.
Three of us
I
worked for a
I worked
scan.
for two of the three major vendors, right?
You did.
Yep.
I worked for one of the three. Paul worked for one of the three.
I think all three historically have sponsored some show on the network as well.
Yes.
But they all will produce plugins or whatever that each of them
Plugin
call
/
them.
CVE.
They based on a CVE. I'm
vulnerability
this is a
management is
serious
still
question. How many of the scan vendors, the ones that we worked for, will write a plugin based on any resource, any knowledge or disclosure of a vulnerability outside of there's been a CVE published?
The answer is,
Unless it gets a
but hold
fancy
on,
name,
hold on.
nothing.
I guess I'll side on the VM vendors for a moment, and the answer is it depends. In that
That's not an answer, Paul.
largely, most of the checks. I was working for you at Tenable when we did this analysis, so I actually analyzed this.
Okay.
Most of the checks were based on a CVE.
Correct.
There were, in my assessment at the time, roughly 15 to 20% of the checks that did not directly correspond to a CVE, that checked for some type of vulnerable condition and would report on that.
Based on what? I mean,
Based on whatever the research and development team that was writing those plugins determined to be a vulnerability. It was
Maybe
just-
ended up in the news or the big-
institutional knowledge, research reports, institutional knowledge, I think, sums it up nicely. Like, oh, you've got the default credentials for this device is a good example. Yeah, there was no CVE issued for that, but I know that this device from this manufacturer in this particular version or operating system or whatever responds to this default password. Or
which is
maybe I
what?
don't. I'm just testing default passwords, and that plugin finds it, and it goes, this is a finding, and then the vulnerability management vendor assigns a score to that because there's no CVSS score for it.
Which is
they'll
why-
assign an internal score and go, I just guessed your default password for your router. That's probably really bad.
Well,
So
this
it's like
is-
a 9 out of 10 severity rating.
So this is why Qualys, the two of the three, went to
that's
QID.
one of the three.
Qualys is
one of the three. Went to a set of checks that necessarily didn't tie back to a CVE,
Yeah.
right? Because if the CVE wasn't available, but they knew that there was a vulnerability, they'd still write a check.
Yeah.
And they called it a QID, but didn't necessarily map back to a CVE.
It got an internal check
It got
ID.
an internal check ID to
in
check
Nessus,
this,
we call
right.
that Nessus plugin ID. And
Right.
Qualys, it was a Qualys identifier or
Yeah,
QID.
QID,
right,
Qualys identifier,
Rapid7
yeah.
probably has a similar nomenclature
probably,
for that. Right.
yeah.
But did the vendor that we all worked for do the same thing?
Yeah, Tenable did.
Yeah.
And there was
It
actually
was a
some
plugin ID, and it didn't necessarily have to map back to a QID.
I was
Or
more
to a CVE.
familiar with what Tenable had, and I was like, wow, we have a lot of checks in my assessment because I was like,
That weren't
really in the weeds. I'm like,
CVE-based.
they're not. There were CVE based, and then there were ones that weren't CVE based. I'm
Right.
like, wow, we can detect these conditions in customers' networks that don't map back to a CVE. Then further study and comparing notes to Josh Corman at the time. He and I both came to the same conclusion that, wow, there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there that don't get a CVE.
No, they don't.
Right.
And that's still true
And,
today.
and everybody has to have either a plugin ID that's unique or a QID, in Qualys's case, that checks for the vulnerability, even though there isn't associated CVE.
Which made it hard to compare, basically, with Jeff. My
I'm
my
not
role
going
at
for
that
the
time, right,
I'm not
was
for going for the
comparison, but-
comparison as much, but in terms of criticality, would the vendors, the one that we all worked for, Tenable, would they for these ones that were outside of the CVE range, what kind of criticality would they label or assign to it?
Again, and the answer is it depends.
depended.
Right, it depends.
But
What metric? Your question is what metrics?
What was the
Yeah, what was
metric?
the-
Because if it wasn't a CVSS
It was the
score,
Renault metric.
Yeah, I think
There's absolutely that. Yes, there is
It
absolutely
was a Renault
that.
metric.
it was like the
back
Ouija
then,
board
but-
method, right?
Yeah,
it was
but
like,
I mean, Renault-
I think it should have
Which
this
was
severity,
only a
right?
problem when Renault was disagreeing with like the CVSS scores.
No, true, but no, don't take that
Turns
wrong.
out,
but
turns out he was right though, because you should challenge a CVSS
you
score,
should,
in my opinion.
Yeah,
Because anyone can generate a
2.0 or
CVSS
3.0.
score.
Yeah, and so what I think all the vulnerability management vendors try to do is to look for checks, to look for these vulnerabilities, even though they're not associated to a CVE, right? Now,
But let me.
is this one going to get caught in a normal dev cycle? Maybe or maybe not, right?
Right.
Primarily, anything that's identified as one of these, kind of name vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and all those other things would definitely have gotten caught, right? Because all the vendors would have had to have implemented, Jeff, some sort of check to validate those.
Right.
A check like this that doesn't have a CVE would Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7 have a check for this? Maybe, maybe not. It depends.
I want to transition talking about another vulnerability that I'm curious how we evaluate this.
I wasn't done, but go ahead.
In this context, Sam, and we haven't heard from Sam. You added a story, your story number 7, Slam, Spectre based on linear address masking. And I haven't read this, and I just saw it in your stories, and I was
See, I was really interested in the story below it, but we'll go with this one.
Oh yeah, me too. I mean, Sam, you've got some really interesting stories there, but
Yeah, well, this is yet another Spectre vuln, and the thing is that it exploits Spectre despite the mitigations that are out there. So, and the mitigation, just like always, is to disable this thing called linear address masking. So, just again, the efficiency features in processors have to apparently be disabled. Until they add mitigation for this. And this applies to the latest processors with the anti-Spectre mitigation.
So, Sam, this is interesting. Spectre's been around for a long freaking time. Like, Paul and I were dealing with Spectre when we were at Tenable. Jeff, you were there. This is like 2015, 2016. Like, this thing is so damn old.
It was 16,
right?
17.
When it came out, they said, this is really bad, and there's probably no way for processors to have this look-forward efficiency securely. And all you can do is put a Band-Aid on the current attack, but there'll always just be another attack, unless you were to just accept your processors running a lot slower.
The original Spectre vulnerability, for reference, because I wrote a blog post about this on Eclipsium for the blog, CVE 2017, 5753 and 275715 are credited to Spectre.
After my Tenable time. for the
Yes,
record.
after your Tenable time. Probably still at my Tenable time.
Meltdown,
Definitely after yours.
Meltdown was very shortly thereafter.
Right,
They came out in
right
a very
thereafter.
similar time
Yeah.
frame. Both in January 2018 is when we learned about them, but the CVE numbering went back to 2017.
2017.
Again, picking on CVE. This one of my knocks on the CVE is the nomenclature for the year is when the CVE was assigned, not necessarily when it was disclosed to the vendor, and not necessarily when it was disclosed publicly.
Right.
Is some of my also further gripes.
Or
with
how
CVE.
long it had been there.
And how
Right.
and what the delta was, how exactly.
Because
So,
the Spectre
but-
meltdown was like, that had been around for
4 years.
years, decades.
4 years.
Many years.
Decades. Ben,
6
what
years.
was the Bash one that came out when we were at Tenable? I forget what the name.
I have
and
a
the
vulnerable
logo
Docker
was.
container that does the bash.
But
But
the Bash vulnerability was like it had been there since the very. It was 20 years old.
20
It was
plus
always
years.
Bash.
yeah,
was.
how long? You're right. How long the actual vulnerability
But
was there?
It was
Versus when it was
when it was
closed.
reported.
Yeah.
and-
Yeah.
I actually removed a story on ZFS because it wasn't really security related. It was just it could corrupt files or something like that.
Right.
It wasn't really security related, but
So
it was the same
Spectre
story.
Meltdown's
It was
been
like this has been in the ZFS code for 18
to
years.
Sam's
or whatever.
point, Spectre Meltdown's been around for a long
Shell
time.
shock. That was the name.
Shell shock. Thank
Oh,
you.
Jesus.
It's been around for a long time, and here we are, like 4 years later. I mean, a good 4 years later, and
Yeah.
we still have Spectre vulnerabilities still out there.
But
Well, it's
the
fundamental-
speculative
yeah, of
execution
executing-
vulnerabilities, though, in my assessment, the one that's the worst is Zenbleed. Zenbleed is is horrific. That came out in July 2023. There was proof of concept code. holy crap, did it absolutely work? Because I have an AMD processor that was vulnerable to it, and I'm like, holy crap. That's memory from like other processes that I should not be seeing as a regular user. I was not root.
And there was a derivative to that just not recently that was related to Citrix, like Citrix bleed for Zen.
No, Citrix bleed was a not speculative.
Okay.
Citrix bleed was that Tyler and I talked about this in a previous show. Citrix bleed is interesting for a whole host of other reasons, but not.
I had that story, but I had that story.
They share the same bleed nomenclature.
Yeah. Okay, and that's where I got confused.
Well, this SLAM looks pretty serious because the previous ones to bypass Spectre involved code patterns that were rarely used, but this involves a very common code pattern which is used tens of thousands of times in the Linux kernel.
Oh,
And they have,
Paul, you're screwed. I'm screwed because I'm running the Linux kernel basically as a Mac OS.
But the
so.
Spectre meltdown is an example of there was researchers that spent a whole lot of time finding a very esoteric. Vulnerability that now that it's been disclosed, as this article reveals, there's people that are like, what can I do with this? That if it hadn't been disclosed and made public, I would wager that most bad guys are not tweaking.
Jeff,
with it.
in my assessment, it opened up Pandora's box, right?
Yes.
And I wrote about this, and this is one of the things I wrote about and talk about, right? Is that it opened up Pandora's box from a research perspective.
Yep.
And we understood like these type of attacks are possible. So what other types in this attack class are possible? So you've got, I chronicled after Spectre and Meltdown, we had 2018 Riddle, 2018 Fallout, Foreshadow, Zombie Load, Cash Out. Then we had Zen Bleed, AMD Inception, Intel Downfall recently this year.
How many of these had logos?
Most of them had logos.
Okay.
So they're publicly available.
Zenbleed being the one that like you have to remediate that one because that was the worst one. But it made us realize that yes, these vulnerabilities exist. Yes, they are exploitable. Although I don't see a whole lot of, and Tyler's not here, but Tyler stepped away for a moment. But like, where are these being exploited in the wild? I haven't seen a whole ton of research on that, but I think we're getting to that point, right? And why I think it's important for us to recognize the original research and realize once that original research in Pandora's box is opened, the clock is ticking. And the clock could have various different time settings to it, but it's only a matter of time before this becomes more operationalized.
So I think what's interesting about this is that we never solved the root issue with Spectre and Meltdown.
Correct.
Right? Like if you
that's because it wasn't
clock,
really solvable. There was no solution.
Spectre and Meltdown was most of these are horrible
so
solutions.
we opened the Pandora's box, and we haven't solved the root problem of this vulnerability. So it gives researchers, back to our previous segment, the ability to continue to do research on this to find other kind of variants of this vulnerability. Now that we disclose this, and it's like, well, shit, we never solved the core problem.
Correct. And there's a few examples of this that, I know, it's kind of concerning for me. What was the one? It wasn't integer overflow. What was the one where it was a flash vulnerability that made us realize that particular bug class was actually exploitable?
Shit.
It wasn't integer overflows. It was some variant of memory. It was some variant of memory corruption.
For Flash.
And we always knew, like I traced back this bug class to like 1967, where a researcher was like, this type of memory corruption could be a huge issue, right?
End curses? Was it the end curses?
No, it was some memory corruption kind of similar to integer overflow or something like that. And we were like, that's a bug class, but we don't think it's exploitable. And it wasn't until like 2008 where I want to say it was someone like Charlie Miller or someone like that was presenting on Flash vulnerabilities that they're like, oh yeah, like by the way, in 2008, so 1967 to 2008, we're like, not really exploitable. Oh wait, it was
all
like,
of a sudden, holy shit, somebody found an exploit.
This, not just this particular Flash vulnerability, but this bug class is now exploitable. And that opened up Pandora's box that since 2008, that particular memory corruption, again, I'm saying integer overflow, but I think it's something different, is exploitable. And we see this time and time again today.
Which is why we haven't seen things like the OWASP top 10, for example, shift
right.
very much. The same shit every year.
Same shit, different day.
You look at the OWASP top 10, you look at the Verizon data breach report, you look at all these things that are driving these breaches. We haven't solved the core issue on any of these yet.
But there's also, in the last couple months, I can't think of the context, but I've seen reporting and analysis where, companies like do surveys, investigations of, their pen testing or their investigations of forensics, actual incidents, and the number that comes up is how many of the vulnerabilities that we disclose are actually used by the bad guys.
Right.
And I don't know what the exact number is, but it's relatively small, like 6% or something like that. So we have this whole industry that's wrapped around the axle around vulnerabilities and disclosure.
But it's all about exploitability at the end.
It is, but there's still this fundamental problem. Like, I would love to get a bug bounty on, I would like to report a bug bounty on, default passwords, but we can't do that. But that's still a way that the attackers exploit things.
Speaking of default passwords, and knowing that we don't have a ton of time for the segment, there's a story out there that I want to hear from Akira, because Akira doesn't get to come on the show, so let's hear from her.
Thank you, Larry.
Let Kira speak.
Good segue.
Let the people speak.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was just going through these articles, and one caught my eye: the exploitation of Unitronics PLCs used in water and wastewater
So
systems.
Paul's story number 5.
Yeah, Paul's story number 5. Yeah, this blew my mind. I'm actually this blew my mind. I am super curious all the time about exploits that affect things like our supply chain and things that affect our public safety systems, right? So that's why this caught my eye. For those of you that don't know what a PLC stands for, it stands for Programmable Logic Controller. Essentially what a PLC does, from what I'm understanding here, is it controls and monitors the process of water and wastewater treatment, right? So essentially it'll turn off the water when it needs to turn off. It'll flow chemicals in the correct way, in a regulatory way. Think of it kind of like little gatekeepers, right, for how this wastewater and water treatment, how it's flowing, essentially.
Sure, many applications, but yeah, and this one is particularly concerning.
And many, Akira,
Akira, I can take this beyond just wastewater to nuclear power,
industrial
and
control systems,
all kinds of systems where freshwater systems to mitigate potential heat,
which is why this is even more scary.
Oh my God, yeah,
So what I saw in this article, I think what happens is that someone had a default password.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I came to the same conclusion, Akira.
Hey, it's a tough default password, 1111.
Yes.
It's harder than the nuclear launch codes
At
were
least
for
it's not
60
admin,
years.
for crying out loud.
I'm glad you backed me up in this,
Right.
Akira, because I read the story and I came to the same conclusion.
That's what I think. Yeah, that's what I couldn't get a clear answer either way, but I thought it was interesting that one of their remediation steps was to refrain from connecting all PLCs to the internet.
No shit, really?
Oh yeah.
So have you been for the last 20 years?
So just a little history. My first job was nuclear power. I worked at 2 nuclear power plants.
Which
you
is why
had-
he
you
has
had
no
PLCs.
hair, by the way.
We have
Explains a lot.
PLCs freaking everywhere. Everywhere, right? And these systems control fluid and water and things into and out of the reactor vessel to control the heat and the distribution of heat and all this stuff.
Or like centrifuges.
Or centrifuges.
Could be.
And so this vulnerability potentially expands way beyond water and wastewater. Because if you think about how these PLC systems are used, they're used to cool reactors and all kinds of other stuff. And it's holy crap.
Yeah, you don't want them to get stuck on.
No. No. Or you don't want them to get shut closed. Shut closed is the worst scenario.
Especially in a nuclear reactor.
In a nuclear reactor, you can never stop water into the reactor. You can't,
right.
because it cools the reactor. And if you don't pump water in to diffuse the heat and send it to the cooling tower,
Chernobyl.
Anybody who's ever looked at a
Chernobyl.
nuclear power plant, they all have these big towers to cool water and shit.
Matt, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Hashtag Chernobyl.
Matt, I'm sorry. Dealing with turds is way worse.
But I'm just saying water is very important to a lot of like core systems, not only in water and wastewater, but other industries, nuclear, energy, etc. And so if this vulnerability expands beyond that, like
not just a vulnerability, but what you're saying is all this super critical stuff that keeps people safe is hinging on the fact that someone didn't change a default password.
And they didn't get on the internet.
My assessment was we're all screwed.
We're all screwed.
Oh, yeah.
We've known that for a while. Hey,
hold on. I just
Josh.
I want to hold on. I want
Josh.
to welcome Jim McMurray to the show because we're on this thing where we're texting our friends and just bringing them on the show.
Dude, is he in your
to get
home
their
studio?
insights?
He's in your home studio.
I licensed my studio design to Jim McMurray. So
That's awesome.
I expect licensing fees. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a last-minute thing there, huh? Just pulling people in.
Yeah,
it was kind of a
it's
thing.
a thing we got going on. I'm so glad you could join us this evening, Jim, and it's good to see you.
Good seeing you, too.
Who the hell
Now,
are you?
hold on. Before we get too much farther, Jim is my sensei sifu when it comes to whiskey. And so Jim,
and bourbon and rye
and all kinds of whiskey.
brown
In
liquors.
fact,
Jim-
I think he's known as Whiskey Hacker.
Yes,
right.
he is.
Our choice tonight was Mortlock 20. Mortlock 20 year. So I want to get your thoughts on
Did
that.
we-
You could
did we
probably
do
tell me
okay?
which distillery it came from. It's one of my favorites.
Love it. Totally. Today's not the day for Mortlock for me, though.
Why not?
Mine
What
is
is today?
What?
What is that? I can't see.
Thomas H. Handy Sazerac.
Ooh,
Oh,
very nice.
Sazerac. Ah,
he's fancy.
Sazerac in a
old
bottle?
school.
No, Sazerac is
I didn't see that
a
coming.
Sazerac a kind of whiskey, Jim. We're gonna divert for a moment.
Well, it's a brand. It's a brand. It could be a cocktail.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've always heard of it as
So
a
this is
cocktail.
a rye whiskey. Sazerac rye whiskey.
Sazerac rye whiskey.
Right up Jeff's alley.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're good.
Yep, right up my alley too.
Jim, we were talking about PLCs and default passwords.
I love PLCs.
You're right. I want to get your thoughts on that. Like
I
my
love PLCs.
assessment, and I think Akira's assessment too, was the state of our nuclear power wastewater management hinges on the fact that someone has hopefully changed the default password on the PLC.
Mm-hmm.
And if we haven't done so, we're screwed.
Well, if you remember, I think it was like 12 years ago in Southern California, there was an employee of a wastewater firm that knew he was going to be laid off.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
shit.
we talked about this on the show 12 years ago.
Yeah, it happened in Australia as well. There was a couple of different wastewater treatment hacks. California was one, and Australia was the other.
right. And it was because everything was still default. And he tried to use the excuse, yes, I remoted in, but all the passwords were all the same and they had never been changed.
It's a really shitty
Wow.
excuse.
Super shitty excuse.
Has
telling
anybody
you.
changed their offboarding to account for that now?
I want a bug bounty for default passwords.
Yeah, default bug.
No,
bug
I'm serious.
default.
Like,
Many of these PLCs are deployed and designed to be in field for 10 plus years. So like the ability to offboard someone and or go change passwords across, even if they're not default, but they're simple, whatever the real-time OS can handle, the ability to offload and then go change passwords in the field on things that can't go down for 10 years or 5 years or during a maintenance window doesn't ever happen.
Yeah,
No.
think about what this. Think about
Tyler,
what this.
I'll tell you that for a fact, right? So, because I spent 7.5 years in nuclear power.
You had
That
one
explains a lot
maintenance
about
window.
you.
No, we did change. No, we changed the I/O over to a different system. But how many times did it get changed in a decade? Like
Once.
maybe
During the one-
once?
during the one
during the
maintenance
one
window.
change window.
Well, that's
right?
okay as long as it's
Now,
a really long password.
In a nuclear power
according to
plant,
NIST.
roughly 18 months is a refueling window, right? For a plant.
Sure.
They shut down, they do the system upgrades, but I guarantee you, there's no way those default passwords or those passwords are being rotated because they're only concerned about, okay, I got to change the nuclear rods. I got to get all this stuff done. Like, if you're not changing out the holistic system, which I did in the 90s, you're not getting changes to the stuff because it's just not happening. Like, it's not something that people think about.
You got one change window in 18 months to get this new system in, and then your next one is 18 months later when you can fix all the bugs.
But hold on, I have a question. Why, when you have first deployed these PLCs, haven't you changed the default password? Like a lot of consumer.
So let me take this. We changed the default passwords to a password.
1, 2, 3, 4.
No, it had a bang in it. I'll tell you, it had a bang in it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Because I remember that.
Yeah.
So it was like blah, blah, blah,
And bang was the last character.
right?
Now I gotta change the password to my luggage.
But that password, even if it was changed from default, doesn't change on a periodic basis. It's not rotating like you almost have to think about these systems changing. When you do a maintenance outage, you almost have to think about the process to say, wait a minute, we should also rotate the passwords. And I don't think that happens. It's not part of this.
Hold on. But I want to stop you right there. I think it's better if the default is something other than the default.
Yes.
That I can observe from, one, the documentation, and two, when I reverse engineer the firmware for these devices, which I think a lot of people operate on the fact that, like, we can't reverse engineer the firmware. But I'm going to reverse engineer the firmware. One of the things that I can even find on an automated basis is what's the default password to that firmware. So a threat actress can ascertain the default very
based
easily.
on the manufacturer.
Documentation or like easily reverse engineering the firmware.
Right.
And so if you haven't changed that, it's basically like you've given out the password to all of your PLCs.
But it's okay because using the Purdue model, it's on a layer 3 or layer 4.
But clearly
it's
not
internet
because the
reachable,
advice
so we're
says
good.
don't connect this shit to the internet.
Right. Except things
in the
change.
nuclear power plants for
Except
the
things
longest time.
change.
So just so you guys to know, back in the 90s when I was working nuclear power, we never
1890s?
90s, late 90s, early 90s.
In the late 1900s. What my children's refer to.
I left the nuclear world in 96.
In
Right?
the late 1900s.
Old.
Those passwords we changed the default passwords, but my guess is they've never been changed since.
Okay,
And but that's better than not changing the default password. As in this case, the story that Akira brought up was the whole crux of this story is the default password is 1111.
In 2023.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been changed.
Well, but it's bigger than that. Wait, Jim.
So
got
it's
a question for you.
1112?
No, Jim, you run an MSSP.
It doesn't matter,
right? How often, when you onboard a new client at the MSSP, do you find default passwords sprayed everywhere?
Yes.
Jim, can you hear me?
Guess not.
I'm going to say no. Okay.
I didn't hear anything you said.
You didn't hear a thing?
Huh.
Jim, can you hear me?
He's just ignoring you.
Fuck.
No, he said
That's your answer.
the default password is it's the same. Like, I'm just saying.
I mean, I know that when I talk to MSPs and MSSPs, they find default passwords everywhere.
I can't hear his audio, but that's okay.
It is, well, Matt, you ask.
He wants to know, Jim, how many times you've
When you onboard a
identified as a customer going in.
When you onboard a customer.
When you onboard a customer, how many times do you find people just use the default password?
Every day.
Yeah.
Yep.
Every single customer. Every single one.
It's not just PLCs.
No.
It's not just, like,
Not
it's
just
everything.
It's across the
everywhere.
board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the concern.
My
Why
comment.
is vulnerability
that's-
management
that's
and or
where-
attack surface management not picking those up and,
Oh my
and
God,
stopping that?
Tyler,
So Tyler,
holy
oh
shit,
my God.
Tyler. So you're going back to my time at Tenable, where I was like up in arms in every meeting. I think it was even before you joined, Matt. You might have been there, Jeff, where I was like, can we just have a facility inside of our product that tests for default passwords? And like, what default passwords are you testing for? I'm like, I don't even care. Like, come up with a default.
Admin,
we had a default dictionary, but I'm like,
password.
also,
Scanners.
can we give the user the ability to like enter, like, here's some commonly used passwords that we should never find.
It was available, but it wasn't default. There was there.
So there's two things. We did check for a certain number of default passwords, and I was like, that was great. But I'm like, look,
But not by default.
I've worked for organizations where I'm like, default is different from like the known passwords that you've assigned to stuff, legacy-wise, that you should change. But I'm like, we should account for all these scenarios. I'm like, I want our scanner to identify anyone who's had like a ridiculous default password. I also want a facility where I can go, I know these aren't default, but they're like default for my environment, right? I know, and I worked for a university, and so like I had a set of these passwords in my head, and I worked with the network operations team at the time, and I'm like, folks, we should not ever have this password in any one of our devices. And I got them to all agree. I'm like, we need a facility to check for that. And the VM industry needs to allow us to go, look, in my environment, here's 5 passwords. Go scan all my devices. Make sure none of my devices ever have this password, because stuff would crop up. It would be legacy. It would be in some dorm room somewhere where we deployed equipment in a like horrible location that no one ever wanted to go to. That was like leaking water and had mold everywhere. And so like we never went there. But I'm like, I want to know if that has a default password, because we need to change it. Or not a default, but a known password that we should have changed. And I think we did implement those features, and I think that's something that people should continue to check for. Josh, you had a friend that had was it you or Adrian? It was Adrian. Had a friend that
You confused
developed
Josh and Adrian?
You
yeah.
look like Adrian, only without
Kind of
hair.
the goatee.
Roll the beard out a
yeah,
little
the
bit
hair.
more.
But
Yeah,
it
you're
was a product that basically detected for known passwords, not
It's Adrian.
default. It was Adrian, yeah. Default passwords, but also known passwords. I actually wrote a Python script that would also do that.
Remember this?
Or
Yeah,
there,
it, like,
what's the
detect these
organization that
ridiculous
publishes
passwords.
every year like the most common passwords that they find?
But it's a it's a great. I
but
don't know the
there's-
organization, but I know Daniel Miessler has a GitHub repository called SecLists that has a whole bunch of password databases. And like when I need a password database, what's interesting is on like Arch Linux, someone in Arch Linux community made that an installable package. So like if I'm running any kind of tool and I need a password list, I can like one command line install, like pacman install seclist, and it pulls on a whole bunch of password databases. And so when I'm testing firmware and stuff, I'm like, just pull that password database. And
just brute force the shit out of it.
More often than
But
not.
let me just make a statement, Paul.
It's not brute forcing, it's password guessing.
All the things we've been talking about for all of these episodes, all this, hardware, firmware, this, that, and the other, vulnerability disclosure, and now we're talking about the fact that the most common problem and the most exploited
Yes.
thing
It grinds my gears, dude,
is
passwords.
default passwords
or
and
easily guessable.
guessed
Right.
passwords.
A dictionary attack.
Yeah.
Again, seclist is a bunch of dictionaries that, in modern computing today, you can run these. Like I've run these brute force attacks in my day job against different firmwares and whatever. It finds it like without too much trouble. My system's not even breaking a sweat. I don't even have
No.
like a 4090. I have like a 1080 Ti.
Dude, you don't
and
even
it'll
need
use the GPU.
You
and
don't
go,
need a
"Oh, I just-
qubit to crack these passwords. They're
dude.
just commonly known.
I do it with my like 6-year-old 1080 Ti GPU that I bought on Amazon before the pandemic for $500.
You probably don't even need to go that far.
And
Use
so
a
it-
virtual machine with CPU. Like,
Right? It's like,
go
oh,
on.
Hashcat's like, yes, I will use the CUDA cores on that, and instantly it breaks it. So like,
this
both
goes,
technology
This
and
goes back to War Games, 1983.
yeah, but who
what
uses
was-
a password?
we play a game?
Like Joshua? Is that what you're talking
Joshua.
about?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Like exactly.
Yeah,
It
but
is-
that's
But
still a thing.
all you need is a little bit of
I used to
social engineering.
the password
to figure it out.
guessing. It's a lost
Hey,
art.
Tyler.
But I used to have a
the
great
social
success.
engineering was better.
Tyler, when you go pen testing, how often do default passwords make your life that much easier?
or
They're
easily
always
guessable.
there, but I hate them. Like
So
if
much
I find
easier.
them, I'm pissed off because what kind of challenge is that? Like, why is the Vuln management team not doing this? Why is the
Right.
pen test team
Right.
not found this? Like, if I'm using default credentials, I'm pissed off. This is stupid. You
Speaking
shouldn't
of
have paid me to
really
do this.
stupid stuff, let's
Yeah.
again we're short on time. I want to hit one of my stories. I'm going to speak for myself here.
Go for it, Larry.
Let's do it.
My story number 5, which is a carryover from last week. A man buys a $15 quote router from a thrift store.
Your story number 6. I want to hear about
It
this.
wasn't a router.
Yes.
It was a time capsule.
Yeah, so arguably they said it was a router. He bought an Apple time capsule from a thrift store for $15, and it had backups and backups and backups and
Of
Oh,
really
wait.
stuff.
I can,
Oh, yeah, really good stuff. But do you want to know what pissed me off about the story, Larry?
what?
He said, well, this stuff was from 2010, so this guy's probably dead now. Like, wait a minute.
What?
That's not that fucking long ago.
Wow, he must have been some Gen Zer talking to some boomers.
Yeah, like, oh, it was more than 10 years ago? They must be dead.
Yeah, and contained photos dating all the way back to the 1980s. And found
so
audit
long
history,
ago.
credit numbers, flight
must be dead.
information.
What kind of router stores that much data though in a backup?
It's a time capsule, so it
It's a
stores
time
backups
capsule,
of
so
your
it's
back.
nice.
Was a
Right.
time capsule an Apple product?
Yes.
Did you buy it?
Yes,
Yes.
it was.
Oh, so
It was
cloud.
basically a hard drive.
It was just a hard drive.
It was a hard
right?
drive that was specially designed to take the backup of your iPad,
Your Mac.
iPhone.
Time capsule was like
MacBook.
is a Mac thing.
Yeah, it's a Mac thing. Yeah.
Yep.
Time capsule. Yeah.
Just no
I guess this
iCloud
kind
passwords,
of
obviously.
ties. I just want to say really quick. This kind of ties back to the previous story and their first story, in that, how do I want to say this? We have like all these time spent researching all these really strange, like esoteric, little known bugs, and they have like hundreds of hours of security researchers like spending time on this, and yet we have bad passwords in time capsules. Like people
Yeah,
just,
it's a great
it
point.
kind of blows my mind.
It's
I
a
don't
great point,
understand.
too. Yeah.
Oh, well, actually, that's a good
Kira,
question.
you just like captured the spirit of like our news segment.
Well, admittedly, they since
we
then,
talk about really esoteric vulnerabilities that, as you said, like hundreds of hours from security research. Like, wow, it's really cool.
Spectre.
But like when we do that stuff in the real world, it's like, oh, we guessed the password, or we bought a drive off
like 15
eBay.
years ago
Yeah.
when you actually
Yeah.
used to store your SMS, your text messages on your SIM card.
Right.
And I went and
Yes.
bought a bunch of used SIM cards off of eBay and analyzed the messages
Oh my
stored there,
God.
and found that there were people talking about their AIDS diagnoses. And holy crap, like, but this is 2023, and this
We
shit
still
is
haven't
still
learned.
happening.
Well, no, yeah, wait,
learned.
back up a step.
Yeah,
Because
and
in 2023, your iCloud backup is automatically encrypted. Your S3
Right.
bucket is automatically encrypted. I know the guy whose team turned that on.
But
We have moved forward. I give him
but-
credit.
But my local time machine backup from my from my Mac that goes on the drive. Like, what happens when I take that drive and I like donate it to charity, or I put it in the donate box and ends up at the local Goodwill store?
Once a year, some security researcher gets a present from Santa by buying drives off eBay and does forensics on them and goes, look, I found all sorts of data.
Yep, I rest my case.
But I mean, look,
This kind of goes.
we
Go
we
ahead.
know this.
No, you talk.
We know this exists, right? We have these breach databases, username, password, compromised passwords. Like, we know this data's out there. Like, why aren't we doing something about it in a way that forces us, I mean, really forces us as humans to, like, rotate our passwords? We use the same password over and over and over again. Password
are we
reuse is
still
a
using
huge
passwords?
problem. Oh, my God.
Bing, 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 bing. Say that again, Tyler, for the crowd, please.
Like, why are we still using passwords? Like, we've had FIDO2 for a decade. Like, why has this not been pushed?
Oh, because
And
we
security keys, phones, like pick
'Cause
one.
we're lazy.
It's not a password.
we use SMS-based two-factor authentication.
Economics.
Isn't that good enough?
Economics.
No, because we're lazy.
It's not lazy. It's
Yeah,
economics.
ask the comm how that SIM swapping's working.
SIM swapping is a
Yeah, but even still, I think the biggest challenge is push notifications for two-factor. Like, if you think about what
Why is that a
happens,
challenge? I don't
no,
understand.
you're getting push, and you accept one because
Right. Oh,
you're
you're
tired
talking
of
about
dealing
MFA
with
fatigue.
it.
MFA
it's,
fatigue,
It's
yes.
MFA fatigue. Like, I only have one password in my entire life that pushes me an MFA notification. That's my last pass.
All right,
but
everybody.
I know.
Just to be clear, he's very vulnerable. Please attack
No,
Matt
no.
Alderman.
But I know that
He only has one password.
I've logged in to my password I'm good. It's got two-factor authentication on it if I need it. But we've got to get away from push notifications and forcing people to use their goddamn authenticators.
Wait. Why is your push notification app allowing more than 2 or 3 a minute? I'm sorry.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Mine doesn't. But for LastPass to get into my vault, like if I'm logging in and I'm like, okay, it authenticates to me and it says, you want this. That's the only one I accept.
No,
but
I
there
get
are
it.
so many push authentication mechanisms where
tons.
people get MFA fatigue and they're like, eventually they just accept it. It's just.
But why
it's just
are those apps allowing
broken.
more than
Oh my God,
2 or 3 a minute?
so
Akira, what do you
I
think?
would say I think that there's 2 prongs to this. I think that in AppSec we talk about the shared responsibility principle of like what is AppSec's bag and what is the developer's bag, right? So I think we have really unclear standards on what is the public's bag and what is the security team's
I
bag.
love this
Hey,
point.
fucking nailed it.
I love this point. This is beautiful.
Keep going.
Nailed it. There's also something else that I'm almost reticent to say because it sounds cynical, and cynicism does
Here,
not
cynical?
equal-
Oh my God.
I know.
There is
but cynical, no.
room for cynicism here.
None of that shit. But I don't think cynicism equals intelligence. So I want to have this caveat. This is not something I've proven, but I have a hunch. And that is because the reason we're not solving these issues is because it doesn't make vendors any money to do so.
Jim, this is you. Jim,
Shit, back
Jim,
to
come
the
on.
money. Oh my gosh.
Jim, talk to us.
She nailed it because when you think about
100%. I
Hold on,
totally
hold on.
agree.
Jim and then Matt, hold on.
when you think about these
Hold on, Jim.
systems,
No.
Matt,
Matt,
you're
you're
not
not Jim.
Jim, when you talk to clients and you say you need to do MFA, you need to do push, you need to do FIDO, you need to do something, what do they say?
Maybe next year. Maybe when I have some more budget. I don't have enough time. Everything works great the way it is.
That sounds hard.
it's too much friction.
How much does it cost?
Jim, right? At the end of the day, it's friction, right? But friction has to be balanced with productivity. And so, yes, I get it that a push notification helps you maybe make yourself more productive, but really? Is it going to do that? Because that's where the MFA fatigue attacks come into play.
Paul, give
And
Larry
so
the scotch.
I put all my stuff, all except for one, into a force that it has to gives me a text, makes me force myself to the authenticator. But that's a little more friction. And so if I have the friction, like, am I going to use it, not use it?
I'm
thinking about the easy button.
I'm going to let you in a little secret, and Tyler's going to back me up on this. Your passwords are out there on the internet.
Your vault
And
is.
you may not, hold on. You may not want to think that,
But they're all
but
there.
if you look hard, and sometimes not even look hard, but good Lord, if you look hard, your
all there.
Your passwords are out there.
Mine aren't.
I know because I have friends like Tyler and other people that not everyone has those friends, which I think is maybe something we need to change. That they're like,
we need
your
we need different friends.
your password's out there.
What?
No,
Well, you
I
just
don't-
need some to start with.
I need friends.
So he
Right,
knows your
Tyler.
password?
Like you can.
Tyler, I'm still waiting for you to break into my home.
I have
PC.
recently stumbled across situations in data where I'm like, wow, like fuck, I'm like that password's out there. I'm like that's bad. That's bad. And I go and I go change those passwords, and I'm like, if my passwords are out there, and I've been pretty diligent about OPSEC working in cybersecurity for 20 plus years, I'm like, holy crap, like everyone's passwords out there.
Tyler, you don't
if
stop smirking. Tyler is sitting here smirking. Please
I know.
focus on Tyler.
I'm picking on Tyler, right? But like
But
I know
that's why
He's
because you
literally
have.
sitting here
I know
fucking
Tyler
smirking.
but I know Tyler has access.
Tyler,
to
how many
and-
passwords do you have in your personal storage? Rough guess.
All of them.
700 billion unique identifiers,
Ty-
password username combos.
Your
Wait,
shit-
wait,
your
wait.
shit is out there,
1,100
dude.
billion?
700 billion.
700 billion.
So Tyler, if my password is in there, can you tell me?
Oh, it's in there.
It's in there.
Well, no,
what
no,
I'm
no,
telling you right
but
now
I
is
want to
it's in
know
there.
which
ones, right?
Because I know that
But
there's
also-
some.
I can
but
provide
also-
a nice list, export to CSV,
Yeah,
type
like-
to
but
a
also-
database.
hold on, but
also hold on. There's a correlation to username as well.
Yep.
Yep.
That attackers would have to work hard to do that. and I think we've kind of rotated some of our usernames, and it's not
Tyler's
hard.
smirking
It's not
again.
hard for an attacker to get there.
Tyler smirking again. Go for it,
It's
Tyler.
all in,
Why is
it's
he
all
rolling?
in, it's all
I
in
have AI
dictionary
backing that correlates personas, usernames,
Yep.
password reuse, password iteration, regex across 700 billion. Like, this is high fidelity correlation across just about anything. And mine's, I mean, there are data brokers out there that provide this for like tools like SpyCloud that notify users and
Oh, yeah.
ingest large amounts. We're talking,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
You don't
upwards
have
of
you don't have my
10 terabytes a day
password.
we
Yeah.
ingest.
You don't have my
and
password.
I worked with SpyCloud at my previous employer.
They're pretty good.
Right? They're pretty good.
Yeah.
They're
Like
great.
when you look
Yeah.
at the data they have compared to other threat sources, they're
Work
damn
with some of these
accurate.
commercial vendors in attack surface management. When I was doing that, they were like, "Oh, like you have this set of credentials out there." I'm like, "Shit,
I
gotta go
do.
change some. Gotta go change some passwords, right?"
Hey, I'll be right back.
Now, also, multi-factor authentication definitely does help. Largely,
in the
Doesn't even-
right
that
way.
doesn't even address the other
Right
issue
way.
of sessions and cookies
Oh
and
my
all
God.
the other things that I keep in my database.
Yeah, so you know what?
now we're going back to Citrix bleed. You can have the best friggin' password management in the world, but your VPN concentrator has cached a session that when an attacker goes, "Oh, here's an exploit, give me what's in memory," and there's your session.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Try and defend against that.
No.
Shit. That's why ransomware attackers are so hot. That's why you're seeing all this stuff on Citrix bleed. Tyler and I talked about it below the surface earlier today. That's
Wait,
why.
does Citrus
Like,
Bleed hit Zen apps?
I think so.
Paul, we need to have a month focus on 2FA MFA.
Yeah.
Just saying, because it's a complicated issue.
And I want to bring Jim in as a guest when we do that, because as an MSSP owner, like seriously, Jim, like what you said, you see that all the time. The 2FA, pushback on 2FA. How do you get it? How do you actually get it innovated
I actually
into?
I actually like to tell a great story that just happened last summer. Government employee, they have MFA installed at their facility. He used his actual credentials on an adult website.
Oh, Jesus.
That said adult website was owned. And the attackers went through and found, hey, look, there's this guy who logs into a government facility.
Jim,
using
hold on.
these
I just want
credentials.
to interject something really quick before you get to the rest of your story. All adult websites have been pwned, and all of their credentials have been leaked online.
Ashley
Yeah.
Madison.
Yeah.
Only 50.
Pretty much every single one. Not just
only-
Ashley Madison, but all of them.
All of them.
So he figured, well, I have MFA, it doesn't matter. But then he realized he couldn't get into work for a while for some reason. So he
For
called
some
up
reason.
and had-
For some reason.
for some reason, he had his firewall guy turn off or turn on a high port number so he could RDP directly from his home.
RDP. Okay.
Are you fucking?
And
Okay.
his credentials were force level admin credentials
good
in this said government facility. So within a period of 20 minutes of that port being turned on, the attacker came in and spent a month and a half within the facility exfilling a lot of data and
You can fill
setting
a lot of
aside
data.
some nice little time bombs that all went off all at the same time and encrypted everything. And that government person is still working for the same place, and he's still the senior IT architect and administrator for the same facility.
Please tell me you're joking.
No, that's not his job.
He should have
That
had
can't
his
be right.
testicles removed with extreme prejudice. I'm sorry. That's horrifying.
Nip.
And
It's just one of
and
many
it's
stories,
common.
though, that don't
It is
get
common.
the public.
I just want to.
And that is a pretty common thing to occur. I mean, this is not an uncommon thing.
Oh, Jesus.
I just want to round out some of the stories. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the latest UEFI exploit
Yep.
that deals with image processing in UEFI, and it traces all the way back to BIOS in my assessment.
Yep.
And I'm telling you this because I read an article a while ago that I covered on the show that I can't for the life of me find, and I just haven't spent the time to go back through our story archives to find it. And it came from a coworker who's no longer with the current company that I work for, who's an amazing person doing great things, and it is awesome. And sent me this article a while ago, and I covered it on the show. And it was, remember netbooks?
Yeah.
God, yes.
There was this thing with netbooks where they wanted like an instant boot, like an instant boot netbook, so you didn't have to wait for the operating system to load. And he sent me this whole rabbit hole, like pages and pages, like this whole big long article. And in that article, they were talking about how they achieved this netbook instant boot. One of the flaws I believe, and again, I want to go find the article and read it again. One of the flaws they were leveraging was the BIOS splash screen logo, and the way that it processed that image logo, they were using to circumvent and get that instant boot. And it was, I was like, that's a vulnerability. I'm like, that's really like talk about nerdy and esoteric stuff that I read. Right. I was like, wow, that's really like, you had to read this whole article. It was really cool. So recently it comes out, Binarly has figured out that, oh, by the way, in UEFI, image processing with logos on the splash screen is vulnerable. I'm like, well, that doesn't surprise me in the least based on all the stuff I've read in the past. So I kind of like,
I heard about this once.
Right, put two and two together. But this basically means that your UEFI, similar to like libwebp, right? Like Tyler, we were talking about this earlier, ImageMagick, libwebp, all these image processing, it goes back to like the core of so many vulnerabilities that we observe in the wild. Processing like basically data from an external source, and that anytime you like mix those words together, it means there's some kind of memory corruption flaw.
So Paul, this goes back to the last episode where we were talking to Ed. What is Gen AI really good at? Content and images.
Images.
Well, no,
Images.
There's other things too.
Right.
I mean, there's data analysis. There's generating test data, because that's awesome. I love getting test data generated for me for easy.
Yep.
There's a lot of things that's good at the process.
Right.
Making process efficient.
Yeah.
Lovely
So
stuff.
like fuzzing the image processing now is
Exactly
made
right.
better
Now
by AI.
it's in
right.
the core of Gen AI. So the ability to take my image, my voice, put it on the internet, right, is way more capable than now.
But now
so
you generate a subset of images and you go, okay, feed it through the logo image processing for a BIOS or UEFI, and what crashes? Oh, by the way, there's basically every UEFI or BIOS manufacturer, AMI, Phoenix, Inside, has this vulnerability. And that's what was disclosed recently, which is really kind of frightening to get that low-level access to your system as an attack vector.
Yep.
So, yeah. But, again, not surprising for a whole host of reasons.
My voice is my passport.
Passport, identify me.
My voice is my password.
So with that, I think it's about time for us to round out.
I think we should wrap.
Yeah.
Wrap it.
Soon.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, watching this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and let's get the hell out of here.